Great. Thanks so much. And thank you again for everybody who's online or watching this at some other time at your convenience and leisure. So my name is Erin Seekamp, and this image here is one of the ones that comes to my mind pretty quickly. I live in North Carolina in Raleigh. The coast isn't that far away. It's about 2.5 to 4 hours, depending on where you want to go. And, we're continuing to see changes occurring in this landscape, and it's having dramatic effects on the people who live, work, and play in these places. And so just to create a little interaction at the beginning, what is a place that you think of really frequently when you think about right on the front line of coastal tourism and heritage destinations, lacking resilience and needing support? So if you just want to chat it in, all right, we've got New Jersey, I see. Miami Beach. Coastal Virginia. Fort Monroe. First Landing State Park. The Outer Banks of North Carolina. Jamestown Island, Outer Banks generally. Okay, interesting. Nobody mentioned Venice. Usually this is the first thing that comes to people's minds when they think about tourism destinations that are really at the front line of coastal sea level rise and flooding threats, particularly if you've ever been to Venice and you haven't been there during a flood. It's kind of hard to imagine how deep these waters could be, and if you were there during a flood, that they continue to try to operate while plazas and different areas are completely inundated with water. The Moses Project, if you're unfamiliar with it, is what you're seeing in the top right corner of your screen. It is a very large engineering effort to try to alter the effects of extreme tides and sea level rise on the city itself by creating a physical barrier to the lagoon and keeping water out when it is rising. It is a very expensive project, coming in 2 to 3 times more than originally budgeted, probably 4 times longer than anticipated. And although it has started to function, they're already finding that the time it took to construct it, there's parts of it that already need to be replaced. And so what do we do when we think about, this is a World Heritage site, when we think about how do we try to protect or support these places? There's an artist who had an installation quite some time ago, in 2018, Lorenzo Quinn, and it was these giant hands that were holding up the side of one of these buildings in Venice. And this is a quote for him talking about this installation called Support, where he says, "As an artist, I've always tried to be coherent, and since I believe in helping to build a sustainable world, my art has always reflected this message. Venice, like many cities around the world, is threatened and needs our help and protection. Let's join hands and make a lasting change." And so the idea is that humans can help support Venice by creating change, potentially carbon mitigation types of changes, is really what this was going at. How do we protect Venice from sea level rise? The gallery that hosted it, the Howson Gallery, said that the hands symbolize the role people must play in supporting Venice's unique world heritage. It is our duty to save the witnesses of the past, so the buildings, that cultural landscape, who can only survive with our help. In other words, the past lives in the present, and it also lives in the future memory of generations to come. And so one of the things that this has always made me reflect upon is, we operate through a static preservation paradigm where we want to keep things the way that they were when we, quote unquote, found them or last lost them. And so that's the case here with Venice, trying to figure out how do we keep Venice alive as we've always known it, in the past, in our memories of the past as well. But when we think about that, are we just trying to bounce backwards in terms of resilience, do more of the same? Is there the potential for Venice to be a place where we can bounce forward and think differently about what the future should be and how those values that are embodied within the physical structures of that place could transform in some way in which we can think about a different future, but still hold on to those memories of what Venice once was. And so this is sort of the way in which I discuss and describe the initiative, the Coastal Resilience and Sustainability Initiative at NC State University, is thinking about the capacity of a system to absorb disturbance and reorganize while undergoing change by transforming to a more equitable, sustainable future state of environmental, social, and economic conditions that increases quality of life for all beings while enabling the continuity of ecosystem services, so including those heritage values, intangible types of values for all present and future generations. And so, it is not something that's new, us losing houses into the waters along the Outer Banks of North Carolina or along other coastlines like New Jersey. I mean, this has been happening for a while. It's not something new, but we just feel that it's seems to be more prevalent now, and we're realizing that the change is happening quicker as the storm event intervals become closer, and the dynamics of those storms are changing as well. And so these images are from a National Geographic magazine from 2014, an article thinking about, will the Outer Banks survive? And even then, thinking about moving a building is a way of thinking about transforming it, right? So this house, this toes in the sand house, is really one of the ones that people wanted to see preserved. It's got historic qualities. It's got cameos in movies and television shows and etc. And so moving it is one way that we can start thinking about transformation. The photo in the left of your image is more recent. It's actually from this year. Those are two houses that were recently purchased by the National Park Service using Land and Water Conservation Fund to acquire the houses so that before they fall and before all of the materials are scattered and create a greater public health hazard than they currently pose, that the Park Service would be able to perform demolition and removal of those structures in a more safe and careful way. This is interesting here as well. We're thinking about using funds that come from a tax on oil and gas leases to try to deal with some of the consequences of fossil fuel burning. And so really I spent some time in 2019 in Italy on a sabbatical with a research fellowship at ICAR, which is one of the three governing bodies of World Heritage Sites. And going to Venice was one of those places where I was able to just sit and contemplate. Actually, I walked more than I sat, and just really try to think about how World Heritage Sites and heritage destinations in general have been managed traditionally, and how it's unsustainable into the future, and it really doesn't build the type of resilience that we're going to need in many locations. It's definitely okay in some areas, but not everywhere. There's not enough money to continually bring things back the way that they were after each storm event. And so for a really long time, we've been focusing on adaptation as persistence using an engineering resilience concept with the cup and the ball. There's an event and we move a little bit, but we can always bring it back down. And so we can use engineering to make sure that we stay in a stable state. But when we start thinking about heritage from more of an ecological resilience concept, then we can really start thinking about adaptation as transformation, that there's some threshold that we may pass where we're going to be needing to think about how those values change, and change from perhaps being embodied within a physical, tangible structure to something that becomes a place of ceremony, perhaps, or a place of story that tells of our ancestral past. And so a lot of this too, is continually thought about. I've conducted quite a bit of work with Keep Lookout National Seashore as a project cooperator. And this is an image from one of the buildings there showing the various different levels in which named storms and some unnamed nor'easters landed on this door where the water line was. And Hurricane Dorian in 2019 was the most recent major event out there. And I mean, it just really surpasses the high water marks of the past. And so we really need to be thinking about different ways and moving forward. And so what I try to advocate for is a transformative continuity, understanding of these cultural landscapes, where you have tangible heritage assets, so say buildings, you have intangible heritage, places of deep meaning and identity that are held within people. These places provide lots of societal benefits, particularly because of tourism. There's high dollar related to them. And they are part of our cultural relationships between people and the land and any other living being within that landscape. And so you have a moment where a system gets disturbed and those parts of the cultural landscape start to pull apart. And what we've constantly done is this idea of persistent adaptation. We're going to mend it using an engineering resilience point of view and bring it back to where it was, rather than think about allowing those pieces to maybe pull apart further and be reassembled into some new cultural landscape in the future. And we can do that through anticipatory adaptation. So really planning about like moving that building, or autonomous adaptations. As these impacts are occurring, we're coming up with new ways to go about it. So thinking about the ways in which the Land and Water Conservation Fund is being tested as a potential mechanism to support some more of those autonomous as impacts occur types of events. And what this allows is that the past will always be the past. It's not saying that we're going to lose the past. It's always going to be this process of remembering the meanings that people who lived in these places held before us, and that we may have held at one point in time in that place. But it also allows us this opportunity for discovery. What new meanings can we make in these places or in new places, and what will that look like? And so one of the things, I did see that Michael Flynn was on this call. I'm not sure if he still is, but Casey Dietrich, who's an engineer here at NC State, and I have a new project that will be starting in January, working with Michael and others at Cape Hatteras and the communities that are along the Highway 12 corridor, and thinking about how adaptation planning really can think about transformations if we do it with people in a way that we can embrace that change is coming, and how do we welcome that water, and how do we do so in a way that allows that continuity of heritage values into the future. Having these difficult conversations really necessitate the need for folks there. And so we put together a process that can help us go through this. And the first part is just learning about local place-based values and the knowledge of local impacts, and understanding what people have observed and where changes have occurred. Highway 12, which goes along the Outer Banks of North Carolina, along this ribbon of sand, is continually breached, and it is brought back to life for the most part. We've got a new bridge where we're not bringing parts of it back to life anymore, where we're saying that the highway can't exist on the sand there anymore. It needs to be on a bridge. But thinking about how those places where inlets may once have been, or where they've occurred during storms, what changes have occurred related to that, and then sharing some models of climate projection of potential impacts with those local observations integrated into those, and considering possible adaptations and policies that may even seem fairly extreme. Like, what if we purposefully create an inlet that can help reduce flooding in places of highest value to those people who live there? And then modeling those potential reductions and vulnerabilities if you do that, and understanding people's preferences and priorities. And there's even the opportunity that maybe it's not a time, but at some point potentially implementing some desired approaches and continuing this process over and over again. It's a recursive type of process. It doesn't work with grant funding cycles that last 2 years, right? We won't get to that part of implementation or even getting close to implementation. It's more of an exploration of how these conversations may go, and what this could look like in terms of the future for these places. So now I'm just going to switch from more of the sort of like theoretical driven component of my talk, and I'll just focus a little bit more on some of the past insights that I've been able to document as I try to serve communities as they negotiate living, working, recreating, and even worshiping in these vulnerable locations. Thinking about how to enhance capacities within agencies and organizations for climate adaptation planning, and to provide some policy recommendations that enhance coastal resilience and sustainability in these high tourism destinations with lots of heritage values embedded within them. This is a project that a former doctoral student of mine, Matthew Georgonis, and I implemented that looked at vulnerability and resilience along a spectrum of indicators. And we had 5 indicators for each of these. And we asked communities using focus groups to just use a sticker dot method like you saw on that slide on that last page, to place where they thought they were in terms of their adaptive capacity, somewhere between being vulnerable and resilient. And in some of the communities that we worked with, the predominantly white communities, this was an amazing place to catalyze conversations about being more resilient than you thought you were, and being able to think about next steps and even outline some of those. In some other communities, those that are typically underrepresented and underserved, we worked with some predominantly Black communities, and they in the end started out feeling vulnerable and wanted to be off the charts vulnerable by the end of these focus groups. And it was because these discussions and the way in which we designed the outreach effort really highlighted the types of injustices that they've faced procedurally, in terms of distributions and in terms of recognition. And a lot of this is happening in the Intercoast area of North Carolina, where a lot of these communities have been sold on ecotourism is going to save them. It's going to be the next thing that happens as farmland becomes salinized, is converted into wetlands, and it becomes public lands. There's a lot of Fish and Wildlife Service agency land out there with amazing opportunities for ecotourism. But the development that they were promised never followed with the expansion of these refuges, because even though they build a visitor center in the town, that ends up creating a lot of flooding impacts for people who live on the wrong side of the railroad tracks in that town. People only stop to use it on their way to the Outer Banks as a last stop to use the bathroom before they get to their vacation rental. They've been on the road for hours, perhaps days. They are not about to stop and have a recreational opportunity and support those local communities. Instead, they're going to go on. They thought, well, maybe they'll come back after they get sunburned, right? They'll come back 3 days into their trip, and then that opportunity will exist. Well, that opportunity does exist, but you have to have the means to be able to have an outfitting and guide service company that is actually on the Outer Banks, where those tourists will see those advertisements for those types of opportunities when they're in that place. So again, it's just not coming back in those ways. And part of the problem is that even in designing outreach efforts like this, you know, they've been designed by people who look like me, white women who have good intentions, but really haven't ever, the science behind reaching different audiences isn't there, and it's not being integrated into these outreach efforts of how to best work with these communities to try to create senses of empowerment. You know, we access them because we hired locals to help us gain access to these communities, and we paid them as research assistants, but that doesn't mean that you're actually making a huge change in how we designed our outreach and engagement efforts. This here is looking at hurricane recovery decision-making within the tourism market in Ocracoke and Hatteras following Hurricane Dorian. So after 2019, we received a rapid grant to quickly go out there and try to understand how folks were making recovery decisions, and things that we heard, you know, of why so many people are making bounce back decisions to just return to the same, is because resiliency planning is really just thrown on the backs of the residents, and they don't have the training or time to be able to perform that work themselves. And another key thing that we found was that when the pandemic came not that long after we were there, so it was compounded by that, but the global pandemic created almost a race to recover, to go back to normal, to bounce back, to open up. There was all of this potential once the pandemic was deemed people could ride the ferries and get out there. Then everybody wanted to work remotely, and there was this huge influx of outsiders to places that didn't really even have the health capacities, the healthcare providers, if an outbreak were to occur in one of these communities. But basically, there was this demand in tourism services that was there. There also within these communities there's a really strong sense of place of people who live there. They have really high perceptions of self-sufficiency. They've made it through in the past. They're going to make it through again. Sometimes we hear, you know, I will go out riding my mattress. That's how I will die. I will ride my mattress to the sea in a storm. But what trying to explore how to enhance resilience with sustainability in these communities and think about bounce forward. If people really had like heightened risk perceptions, they had those previous hurricane experiences, and they had started creating connections across the communities, not just within their own communities. They realized part of that, we believe, is related to why their risk perceptions are heightened, and their previous hurricane experiences are being called upon when they're making these decisions to bounce forward rather than bounce back. But if you're sticking within just those who live near you and you don't have that external information, your information sources are not broadened, your network of information isn't broadened, you're likely to just continue to make those bounce back types of decisions. Thinking about climate adaptation planning for structures, this is some of that capacity building that I'm talking about within being a cooperator with the National Park Service for many years, trying to understand how, when you have vulnerable structures that are listed on the National Register of Historic Places, which means that they're all significant, and that historic preservation policy has predominantly said that if it's on the list of significant buildings, then they're all equally significant. But if everything's equally vulnerable and everything's equally significant, where do you turn your attention to first? Which building gets adapted first? where do you put the pen on the check? Who do you write? Which building do you write that check for? So what we did was we came up with a process to be able to measure the relative value between buildings that are listed on the National Register within a historic district as a way at Cape Lookout National Seashore to start helping managers make more transparent decision making about adaptation plans and what they plan to do. And we took that information and which we needed to be able to do what our key task was, which was really thinking about providing some guidance for adaptation planning. So you can see here at the top this historical significance and the use potential on the top right going into that building resource value. Those values get divided by the vulnerability of each of those structures to get a total resource value for each building, and then an accumulated resource value for the entire district. And so what we did was we had a bunch of different adaptation actions that could be implemented, things like elevating buildings, relocating buildings, doing a better job managing those buildings with annual maintenance or cyclic maintenance types of opportunities, or even starting to document them and prepare them for loss or actively removing them. And so for our pilot at Cape Lookout, we had 17 buildings that we specifically selected between two different historic districts. And every building had a resource value, had a vulnerability score, and had costs for all of the different adaptation actions that we were considering. And we integrated them into an optimization model that is able to create amazing visualizations that my collaborator, Dr. Zhao Zhao at Arizona State University and Hainan campus, to look at the patterns of adaptation actions that could be applied over a 30-year planning process. And so what you're seeing where there's the large orange boxes between scenario 3 and scenario 5 is looking at generally similar types of funding models. One is a high value scenario, so you're getting a lot of adaptation actions being selected. They're often getting selected earlier when they can, as soon as they can be afforded. And then in the scenario 5 is actually a model in which there's pulses every 5 years of additional money that gets you to that sort of high. What happens then? And what this shows is that if you don't have sufficient funding early on to create to implement adaptation actions, is that the risk of loss is higher because you're staggering them through those 5 years, and the buildings could be lost during a storm event. The images on the left, those charts that you see there, there's a red dotted line that goes across from them. That's the total accumulated resource value for all of the 17 buildings that were included in it from at time 1. And then what you see in the bars are on the budget is on the x-axis, going from 0 to $500,000 annually. And then the colors show the resource value of buildings, depending on if they get no action, only annual maintenance, and different types of adaptation strategies. So what the curves are showing is the first one is that the maximum budget efficiency is reached actually pretty early on in that model. You've got that steep black line, that dotted line that goes up, and then it drops off over time, but you don't return to those original accumulated resource values until you hit about the industry standard, which was about $222K for these 17 buildings. The chart on the right is just demonstrating a different type of thinking about it. Is as budgets increase, then you can actually start applying more adaptation actions, right? So you need a budget to do this work. And so hopefully the agency is able to use this as these findings as leverage and these visualizations to show that they need sufficient budgets to begin implementing adaptation. Thinking about coastal, the work that we were doing in the first slide that I showed you, and starting to think about some policy implications of it. This is the inner banks of North Carolina. You can see the outer banks at the very edge there. This is between the Albemarle and Pamlico peninsulas. You can see the sea level rise mapping tool from NOAA showing lots of inundation at 2 feet. And so these more rural communities are really impacted heavily from sea level rise, but that there are inequalities in how coastal zone management policies and programs have happened. And the hardening in urban and high tourism areas tends to lead to impacts to ecosystem services that are protecting these rural areas. And really underserved populations are going to be disproportionately placed into forced migration and retreat. And so what my former doctoral student Matt Jonas and I recommended is that we need a coastal commons, that coastal ecosystem integrity is a common resource. It's along the hidden coast, right? Those inner banks where high tourism dollars aren't at play. And that adaptation and mitigation is a human right, and that heritage values are imbued throughout these landscapes as well. So thinking about going back to that idea of thinking about historical and heritage preservation, expanding that paradigm to think about transformation as a component, and being able to move from just thinking about what the concepts for World Heritage sites right now, you're listed on the World Heritage site or you're listed on the World Heritage site in danger. And being listed on the sites that are in danger is really politically unpopular. There's a lot of concern at the governmental level that if you put on that list, any heritage site in your country that's put on that list, then you're going to lose the tourism dollars that have come along with that over time. And so that's really a disincentive to start thinking about the transformation of these places. And so one of the only places that was asked to be put on the danger list was Everglades National Park in Florida. And they asked for it because in the US, it created a different type of political situation. It created funding available to start doing it. And so what my colleague Eugene Zhou at ECROM and I proposed was to create a list of World Heritage sites in transformation, to allow funding mechanisms to be instituted to help people think about how they want to anticipate change, how they may need to start responding autonomously to those changes, and to do so in a way where they can have discussions about how heritage and heritage values will transform. So again, just coming back to this idea about linking resilience with sustainability, it's just really more than ability to bounce back. It's striving to bounce forward. It's the capacity of social ecological systems or cultural landscapes to handle disturbances and change by transforming to more just and sustainable future states of environmental, social, and ecological conditions. A key component is that it recognizes the technological, biogeophysical, social, financial, and cultural opportunities for innovations. It's time to discover. It's time to stop thinking about only moving backwards and preserving what has been rather than thinking about what can be. Because in doing so, that'll increase quality of life for all beings and enable the continuity of ecosystem services for all present and future generations. And I think to Babcock Ranch in Florida, which is a community that was designed with really sustainable community design and resilience in mind, and was able to withstand a hurricane that impacted and devastated all of its adjacent communities. This one never lost power because it's devised around solar. This one didn't have flooding impacts to the home because they created these lakes to serve as a place to move water. They've designed the landscape as something that can enable change and be able to handle disturbance. So thinking back to this, because I think now Venice will be something that will be in the forefront of your mind when you think about coastal resilience in tourism and heritage destinations. What would transformation of this place look like? Start thinking about the innovations that we need to get us there. And with that, I'll just say thank you. And if you want to learn more about the Coastal Resilience and Sustainability Initiative at NC State, the link is below. Happy to take any questions.
Thanks so much, Erin. It does look like in the chat, Rebecca has a question. So Rebecca, I'll let you, if you wanted to unmute yourself and ask your question.
Sure. You had a slide. It was before the OptiPres slide.
Yeah, I know exactly which one. So you're talking about the framework. This one. Oops. This one.
Oh, nope. This one. Yes, for sure. I was just wondering how the weights were applied to determine that.
Yeah. So that's a great question. And this is how we integrated the heritage values into the mechanism itself. So we used more expert knowledge to come up with the scores for the metrics that you see, the distance between those things. We did have some stakeholders in the room, external stakeholders in the room, but really between the attributes, the main boxes in the darker green, and then these sub attributes that are in kind of like an olive green. So the 4 key attributes: association to fundamental purpose, character, condition, and national register, as well as the defining character, uniqueness, space, spatial significance, and eligibility. We went through a process in which we elicited those weights and used, at that point, we were using mean values to bring together those, once you have the scores for each building, how they get calculated. And so that we normalize the values that you see for the scores before we combine them, since there's multiple different numbers of metrics.
Can I just have one follow-up question? I'm sorry, I don't want to monopolize it. Did you take into consideration the age? Like, because I see the condition of the structure.
Yeah.
But what I'm kind of getting at is I'm a PhD student, or I guess candidate now, working on some stuff regarding flooding and reoccurring flooding and building claims. And one of the things that definitely comes into consideration is the fact that building requirements, like when you're actually constructing a building, changes over time, right?
Yeah.
So maybe requirements are less stringent historically than they are today. And as a result, like age might play a role in whether or not it will fare, I guess.
Yeah, and that's great. So I would say that would come into the sensitivity analysis, which is in the vulnerability assessment. So we've a partner with Western Carolina University's folks out there, Rob Young's group. And so what they have, and they've done this for all coastal parks within the National Park Service, is developing a protocol for exposure and then for sensitivity. And sensitivity would include sort of what you're getting at. Not quite to the T in which you're discussing it, because age depends on what building materials were available and what standards looked like at that time. So age hasn't been a factor necessarily, but the sensitivity of the structure itself to past events is.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Rebecca, for the question. Open it up for additional questions from the audience. Feel free to raise your hand or type your question in the chat if you don't want to unmute yourself. Questions? Go ahead.
I just ask? Erin, Hamish Rennie here from New Zealand. Cultural heritage. Most of this looks to be about physical buildings and structures. The Florida Everglades is sort of more of an ecological heritage, in my sort of understanding, my limited understanding of North America. What about cultural heritage for Indigenous peoples? How do they factor into your studies?
That's a great question, and I would say that Everglades, that's key, right? So, Seminole Tribe of Florida is, that's their ancestral lands. They were removed from those lands. They have limited access, but they do have, in the US, it's complicated with the consultation processes for actions that could, affect, traditional use areas. So I have been conducting quite a bit of work with the National Park Service, trying to think about what Western scientists and the National Park Service call archaeological sites, and how to build a similar type of model for planning, adaptation planning of archaeological sites. And early on in that process, the individual ways of knowing of different tribal nations make it very hard to create any kind of standardized approach. That you really need to, I spent about 3 years in listening sessions, and working groups where I was asking for help and input to even ask the right questions, because when I started, I was creating harm in the questions that I was asking, because asking people and showing them what we did for buildings was very harmful, and asking them to think about their traditional use areas, because their ancestors are there, and their ancestors are, their worldview, many tribes, and not all, again, right? So every tribe has a different worldview, and we shouldn't make gross generalizations, but the word beings that I keep using is coming from my work with citizens and staff of tribal nations, Native communities, and other indigenous peoples. Because when we think about a cultural landscape, it's everything within that landscape. It's not what an archaeologist would say as what's important in that space. It's the connection. It's the reason that those archaeological remains, or those ancestral objects, are actually located there, is because of the context of the entire landscape and what was in that landscape at that time when it was occupied by those peoples. I don't know if I answered your question at all.
Well, I guess, how do we bounce forward in that situation?
Yeah. So the work that I've been trying to put forward there is really, that meaningful engagement needs to occur, and there's lots of different approaches. A former doctoral student of mine, Courtney Hotchkiss, recently published with myself and another committee member, Alicia McGill, some guidance on meaningful engagement. It's published in Park Science Forum of September of 2020. And that so much of that, it was learning by having partners who were willing and who we were able to build trust with. And trust takes a long time. And again, this is very hard in academia to get past the tenure and promotion process, to get past the grant cycle process, to build these enduring relationships, because that's what they need to be. They can't just be coming in and leaving. That's happened for too long, and so much harm is associated with it. And so, but we've been finding mechanisms to hire students at tribal colleges, as interns and research assistants, for not me, but for the local tribal historic preservation offices, to be able to do work with elders to understand this as a process, to pass that wisdom down, and that indigenous knowledge, indigenous, traditional, and ecological knowledges down to the next generations, to ensure that it stays within their community, to avoid issues of intellectual property rights, in which me having access to that information may not be correct, and me using it incorrectly would be very problematic and create additional harms. We talk a lot about having opportunities to hire more indigenous peoples within the public land management agencies, and to try to fast track them and get them training to be administrators of those lands, to have conversations about hiring people from local communities as monitors, so that when the triggers that they see are concerning, they can bring it to managers' attention. They can talk about what their preferences are for adaptation. It's at such a larger landscape level from the conversations that I've been engaged in. It's not these like move a building. It's like very large, like reintroduction of species into landscapes to create the balance that's missing. It's very different than what we see right now in a lot of places as what's being recommended as adaptation options.
Thank you for that response. A lot of really important things to think about as we continue to work on this kind of stuff moving forward. Any other questions from the audience?
Hi, Erin. It's Lindsay Usher. How are you?
Hey, Lindsay, nice to see you.
Yeah, you too. I was wondering, the work that you did on the Inner Banks, where they were talking about the visitor center. I was curious if you could share which communities that was in.
Yeah, so the visitor center is in the town of Columbia, and so there's two. The town put one right next to where the Fish and Wildlife Center put one. So it's Highway 64 going out. You're almost there, right? And so it just, from the interviews that Matt conducted over 3 years with community members out there, I mean, it's really, they keep trying to try to promote Columbia as a place to stop and stay longer, but it's just not really coming through. Research that some students in a class of mine, they looked at that county, that Terrell County had an ecotourism committee. And so a lot of the insights that I have are from the research those students did on the history of that partnership. It was a huge partnership between federal, state, local entities and local business owners and residents to try to promote Terrell County as a place for ecotourism from the Outer Banks. One of the Black communities is not a listed named community. It's just an area called Alligator. The part of Creswell that gets flooded from Creswell's another community. The part of Columbia that gets flooded by the visitor center is called Railroad. They're on the other side of the tracks. But the community of Alligator, their greatest concern is that they're so low lying, and that as the agricultural lands that they used to work around them keep getting purchased and either made into an NGO type of preserve or being transferred to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. They've had so many repeat events. You know, they say things like, well, I don't know that anybody's ever told me about what climate change is or isn't, but I can tell you every storm where that water's hit and what's happening in my community today. And their greatest concerns is that FEMA will come in and they will say things like, okay, your one house needs to be condemned. Here's money for rent. Well, there's nowhere to rent in that community. And they're so cohesive that people are not going to leave. But they're also dealing with youth out migration. So they know sort of there's this weird limited time frame for their community. They recognize that youth don't want to come back. And so they fear that developers are just going to come in and start buying out, or as soon as FEMA condemns all of the houses at once, or they're part of one of the early forced migration retreat communities, that it's going to become this place of big houses on sticks for people who have money, who can afford to do ecotourism types of activities.
Yeah, thanks. That's where I figured it was the Columbia area. And so that's what I was wondering. As somebody who worked for a kayak operator that did tours on the Alligator River from the Outer Banks, yeah, it's definitely an issue. And it's interesting to see, you know, how could those outfitters potentially partner with those inland communities, you know, to get people to stay there. And so that's really interesting. So thanks for sharing more details about that.
Yeah, sure. The other community that I mentioned was Creswell, and they're like, what was so glaring for them was they looked at Highway 64 right outside of had a meeting at a volunteer fire station. And we all walked outside and they said, look at where the new bridge is and look at the roofs in this town. And the bridge was over every roof in the town.
Wow, yeah.
Tom, you had it muted before. I wasn't sure if you wanted to ask a
Oh,
question.
no. Just a little bit. I wondered how this may not contrast well with Creswell versus, say, Norfolk, but the role of like technology in getting people to maybe mentally imagine these future landscapes. You finished with that awesome example from Florida. I kind of wondered, I don't know much about it, but is there a role for technology like visualization, simulation? We see everybody in their phones so much these days, and can basically imagining a future, maybe it's relocation or retreat or things like that. Just wonder if you've run across this or have any thoughts on that technology.
Yeah, there's a lot of early work. I can't remember who the scholar is, but out on Vancouver Island, they've done a lot of sort of visualization work, looking at different sort of sea level rise scenarios and where inundation will occur, and have been able to create 3D renderings sort of what it's like. And I think that it creates something a little bit more tangible than just talking about it. That I think that there's a place for VR in this, where you're standing where your house is and you can see what's going on. I think there's a huge place for technology and visualization in this. I would say that in my work, I partner a lot with the Center for Geospatial Analytics here at NC State, who does a lot of that type of visualization work and has some really cool tools to do it. Early on, when we started the work at Cape Lookout back in 2017, we ran an experiment to see if heritage managers who are off-site, people with that preservation expertise, could see 360-degree views of the building in its current landscape, and then at the same time have a sea level rise model that will run that shows changes in land cover type, and then be able to assess, thinking about those, just the vulnerabilities from looking at that, what types of recommendations they would make for adaptations. And honestly, they felt so uncomfortable doing it without being guided through the vulnerability assessment part of it, that it was a really interesting. We sent it as an individual exercise, and people just immediately started calling and said, I need somebody to walk me through these visualizations so that I understand them. So we need to make sure that as we derive these types of technological innovations and that we think can help, right? Just like my former student Matt Tortonis and I thought we could help people by conceptualizing adaptive capacity on this spectrum from vulnerable to resilient. You can create more harm in some situations.
Good. Thank you. Enjoyed the talk. Excellent.